We're here with First Nations educator Virginia Morgan, and this is part of our conversations with educators regarding their practice, their teaching in an Aboriginal education. So Virginia, maybe you'd like to introduce yourself.
Good morning. My name is Virginia Morgan. That's my Christian name. In the feast house, my name is Tick. It means little hawk. I was originally born in Alert Bay, BC. So I was born into the Kwakwaka'wakw people, so I am part of the Namgis Nation. But my father comes from Gitwangak, where we later moved, so I'm also Gitxsan.
Virginia, maybe you can tell me a little bit more about the school and community that you are teaching and working in.
So I'm working at Hazelton Secondary, which is right in Hazelton. We have around 85% First Nations students, yes, with 6 surrounding villages. It's a small, I guess for, if you're down here, it would be considered a small school because we have a little bit more than 300 students. The school is shrinking because of our economy. People are moving away for jobs. So it's a small community in comparison to Vancouver. So we have, I think it's around 22 teachers in our school. We have 3 First Nations support workers. We have a counselor, principal and vice principal. There are 3 of us maybe that are First Nations teachers, not all status.
What is it that you do and have been doing?
My main focus has been First Nations cultural classes, the Gitxsan classes. And within those classes, I don't teach the language because I don't know it myself, but I've been working with students about all of the cultural aspects with many hands-on courses. But I also teach First Nations art and carving. So
wonderful. So maybe let's start by talking about the ways in which you include, integrate, work with Aboriginal content or perspectives or ways of knowing in your teaching.
Well, I think in all that I do in my classes, I am bringing First Nations content into the classroom, not only because it's a mandate that I do that, because it comes from my heart. It's where I live, it's how I breathe, and it's, how I am with the students. The content that I bring in, being Gitxsan cultural content, I start off the year with my grade 8s looking back at our history and what it was like even in the Stone Age. I bring my stone tools and bone tools into the classroom, and when we're taking a look back at our history and how our people lived, it brings the students closer to who our people used to be before European contact. And we take a look at what it was like, and not only how our people survived, but how they thrived in our environment. So in doing so, they have kind of a small look at our people before European contact.
You talk about when you first start working with students, that building relationships is really important in beginning the work that you do. Tell me about why building relationships is important and how you go about doing that.
The very first day when I have I call them my kids, they're not just my students, they're my kids. I'm a grandmother of 12. I have 4 children, so they're like my larger family. So the first thing for me is get to know the students. It's important that I teach curriculum, but it's more important to me that I am talking to my students and I get to know them. Because if they are your family, you need to know more about them, and to better teach them, you need to know what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, who can I call when that person is in stress, so just getting to know them on a personal basis. So usually I'll ask them, who's your family? Not where were you born, but who do you come from? Because that to me is so personal. Who do you come from? Which family do you come from? What is your lineage? And what's interesting sometimes is students don't always know. And so we start looking into that. Who do they come from? And who's your grandmother? Who's your grandfather? What's your chief's name? What house do you sit in? So if they don't know that, we start looking into that, so they're being brought closer to their own culture.
So taking the time to learn about their background, their families, and their communities is very important to that relationship building, it seems. Um, what are the what are the benefits, I guess, for student learning, or how does building these relationships really help the students in their learning process?
Well, when I first started teaching, we'll go back to that, I didn't have that right away. It comes over time, and I think the more you delve into learning more about yourself as a teacher, you start seeing what the kids are missing. One of the things first I'll explain is I became a teacher because I had two mate teachers in my lifetime that meant a lot to me, and when I was going through troubled times, they were the ones that were there for me, and they knew when I was down and out, and they knew when I needed that help, and they made sure that I got it. So it just made sense to me when I was becoming a teacher and being in an educational role, that I do the same for my students, is not just being there for them, but making sure that they have what they need spiritually as well as educationally.
And so we've talked about, the benefits and the contributions of that relationship to student learning. Let's talk about that relationship building to your own teaching. So how does fostering really positive relationships uh, support, enhance, or facilitate your teaching?
I think without the relationship, it's really difficult to teach a student. Um, if you're in a cold environment, they're not going to want to learn. And if they feel like they are not uh, acknowledged as a person first, they're there, but they're not wholly there. And I think enhancing what we have in the classroom really is about building relationships, and so that they feel like they're in a place of learning. It's a comfortable place to be. So there are times when I put on a pot of tea because I'm a granny. I put on a pot of tea, or sometimes I'll put on fried bread, and that will be part of our lesson. Because I remember my grandmother telling me, when you're getting ready to learn, she said, sitting down and having a cup of tea or even fried bread, it's when you're taking that in, it's not just eating fried bread. You're actually, it's symbolically, you're taking it in, you're absorbing what you're learning. So you're sitting and it's not just about talking, all the time.
So, Virginia, maybe you can describe for us the features or characteristics that foster or contribute to a positive relationship between a teacher and Aboriginal learners.
So I remember at some point going to a workshop and hearing from, I don't know if you know him, but David Rattray. And one of the things that he said that has always stuck to me is, you never keep a student waiting outside. You don't lock the door as soon as the bell goes and just have them waiting, because that's not welcoming. So I don't lock my door. My door is open. And sometimes the students come late, but you don't embarrass them. You just walk over to the side and talk to them about, why is it that you're late, and what can we do about that? So you're always keeping the conversation going. So to me, it's a lot about conversation and heartfelt conversation. And when the student is in class, I think the relationship building just continues. The more you continue to talk to the person where they're at, because we're not all at different levels or same levels, we're at different levels of learning. So if you're talking to them where they're at, where they feel comfortable, they're more apt to open up a little more to you and be comfortable with you.
Okay, wonderful. How do you work through difficult relationships? Because this sounds like, this seems very seamless in terms of open door policy, building community, sharing, inviting conversation with the students. and lots of the other things that you're describing, but have you had some challenging experiences in being in relationship with students?
Oh, I've had many difficult relationships or difficult students that have come in. And, you know, it doesn't matter if you're First Nations or not. Some students just come in with a lot of baggage. And I think it's in that getting to know them where they're at is what makes the difference. But to be able to move forward from that is just actually taking the student aside and finding out really what is the problem. Because if that student is hungry, or if that student's been up late at night the night before and couldn't get to sleep for whatever reason, they're not there to learn. They're probably got a headache, or they've got they don't feel well, and so to sit there and try and make them book learn or anything else just isn't going to happen. So you have to make the best of the situation, and you've got a classroom to run, and sometimes up to 32 students. So you don't want to spend a lot of time butting heads. You actually want to just, you just talk to the student about, okay, I'll give you 5 minutes. I'm going to come back to you, and we'll have a conversation. And in that time, you get your classroom going.
Yeah. So it sounds like taking time becomes really important. Having those kinds of conversations and being flexible are really important, are also important to the success of creating relationships with students. That's wonderful. Thank you very much for sharing that. So when you describe your approach to integrating Aboriginal content and perspectives and ways of knowing in your classroom, or in your teaching even, not just within the classroom space, but in your teaching, you talked about having students get to know their history, understand who they are, where they're from, and who their people are. Can you describe for me maybe some of the projects that you engage students in to do that kind of work?
Sure. I brought a few projects with me, and this is actually, it's called tadak, and it means tie down strap. But historically, the women would go out into the mountains and they would gather the mountain goat wool, and they would bring it home and clean it and prepare it and spin it before they even got to make the project or their strap. So today what we do, our students will actually research that, and in researching that, they're also asking their grannies and sometimes their yeas, and when they're doing that, they get all of these rich stories that come back into the classroom, and they're so proud to talk about it. And as they're making their project, sometimes a student will get a little bit flustered, and they might say, well, Miss Morgan, I don't really like the way this knot is, or it hangs out here. And we start storytelling, and I start talking to them about, in our lifetime, sometimes we have little bumps in the road, and sometimes we make choices. So we just turn that into a different kind of learning story. And while we're talking about the bumps in the roads, then another story will come out, and they'll say, yeah, my granny used to tell me that, I shouldn't do this or that, or sometimes they'll talk about their yes. So going back in history and looking back at the richness of our history, it's important that they learn about that, so that not only do they learn about where they come from, but we start talking about the choices that they're going to make for the future.
Wonderful. Can you tell me a little bit about the tie down strap?
So the tie-down strap historically used to be used for just about everything. My grandmother had a cradle. It was a steamed bent cradle made out of cedar, and she used to take all of her kids up the mountain, and the boys would go out hunting, and then she would stay back and do some berry picking. Well, she would take this tie-down strap and tie it onto the cradle, and actually put the cradle up into a really strong branch and swing the baby while they were picking berries. Other times the men could use it for actually putting it like a sling and carrying a moose out of the bush, sometimes in quarters or halves. They were used to carry bent boxes on their back. So they would strap the bent box on and have it across the shoulder, and then also have another one that would go across on the forehead. So you would distribute the weight. So it was used for quite a few things.
So in terms of the research and the preparation of this, what kinds of skills and knowledge are students engaging in? It sounds like they're starting with storytelling by researching and talking to their parents, grandparents, and other members in the community. They're engaged in a form of storytelling. What are other practices that they're engaged in the preparation, research and preparation of this artifact?
Well, for the research part of it, they actually sometimes will have a book available. Other times they go online to look at other nations and what other nations did at the same time. And one of the interesting things we find is, even in Europe, people were weaving, and they might have been weaving a strap or, a woven blanket. So all across the world at different times, we were all doing similar things. So it's very interesting that we find that out. But they're learning computer skills as well as reading skills. And if they're having difficulty reading, then I usually just sit with them and we talk through it. What I find important, even more important, I think, to me than the technology, is going back to the old ways, because that's how we used to communicate, was to sit and talk to our grandmothers or our yeas or people in the family or community to find something out. We would actually sit and talk and have the storytelling, and that's where our strength comes from, is from the storytelling and for the people in our community to show us what we need to do. And it's lacking today because too many kids are actually texting. They might have a friend next to them and they're texting somebody else. They're not actually having conversations. So it's important to have those conversations.
Now, as they prepare to make the item, are there certain cultural protocols that they follow or learn about?
At this point, a lot of what I teach in the class is almost lost. We talk to the grandparents, and there are some houses that have certain colors, or they'll have a certain design. So you can't take from somebody else's house group their colors or their design if they have that. So there are certain protocols that they follow. And other than that, some of the grandparents will say, you know what, we've lost that. I don't even know. So they'll just say, I know that on my blanket, this is what we use. So, we get permission to do that. But other than that, sometimes a student will, this one here, a student just chose our Gitsan colors, the red and black. We don't always use white. The red is the life force that runs through us. The black space is the negative space outside and around us.
What I really appreciate, Virginia, about your examples are how, when you're having students engaged in the creating of really significant cultural items to their community and, well, to themselves, their families, and communities, that they're engaging in research, they're understanding the significance and the meaning of those items. Uh, they're learning about the protocols associated with it. And I think it's really important for us as educators to be aware that um, when we're having students engaged in cultural practices or in creating artifacts of culture, in the way we do, say, in Aboriginal, when we want to engage students in Aboriginal art or the creation of Aboriginal art, that we're having students develop the meaning, the significance, doing that kind of research, the protocols. So it's not just about creating an artifact of the culture. There really is a whole learning process that goes into engaging students in the creation of these very significant cultural items. So that's wonderful. What advice would you have for educators who are either in the beginning process and looking for ways to be inclusive and work respectfully with Indigenous content, Indigenous knowledges and perspectives, and even pedagogies in their teaching?
I think the biggest thing for me, even as when I first started teaching, was building the relationships. Because more than anything, your student is going to want to learn if there's a relationship. They know that it's comfortable for them to ask questions. Because I always tell them there is no wrong answer. It might be a different answer, but it's not a wrong answer. So sometimes we go about it in a different way. It goes, we come full circle. And I think being comfortable to go out into the community, get to know the students in their community as well as at school. Some of the students that we've had that we've taken out on the land have been very troublesome students. Not troublesome, they've been troubled. And sometimes they get to have a reputation in the school as skippers or troublemakers. We've taken them out on the land, and in that relationship building, they get to know us as people, not just teachers. When we're back in the classroom or in the hallways at the school, it's, "Hi, Miss Morgan. How you doing, Miss Morgan? Have a nice day, Miss Morgan." Where that never happened before. So you get to know them as a human being before you get to know them as a student. So just opening that relationship and being patient. One of the things that I find even as an adult, when somebody, if I'm in a course or if I'm learning something new, I find that it takes me a long time to absorb things. And I don't know that that's a First Nations thing. I just know for me that it takes a lot longer sometimes to absorb things, and I'll have to mull over it 3 or 4 times. So to ask somebody a question in the classroom and expect them to answer right away, some students are awesome at that, but not all are. So to be a little more patient when you expect, for people to answer, maybe they really don't know and they're uncomfortable. So I think being patient with the wait time.
And I think you're right, being patient with that wait time allows for more of that reflective thinking that many of our students do engage in their learning process. Okay. So we're talking about some of these strategies that support Aboriginal learners. What are other strategies that you find effective in working with Aboriginal learners? You have talked about relationship, you've talked about wait time and that kind of developing that kind of patience. Are there other strategies that you utilize or would recommend for us as educators to be thoughtful and mindful about in our own practice?
I think really keeping an eye on the student and finding out what their strengths are. I think we all have strengths and gifts. One of the things that I find with First Nations students, they don't feel like they come into the school with gifts or anything that they can offer. Somebody else is always smarter. And I don't think that's because they're being treated that way. I think they just come in just feeling that way. Not all of them, but so to find the strengths. So really what you're doing is keeping an eye on them. And, once you find their strengths, you're able to say, okay, awesome, you know how to do that. How about we reinforce what you already know, because now you're going to teach. Yeah. So sometimes then you'll buddy them up with somebody else that has either the same difficulty or they've got a strength that they can share. So I think opening up the class to other students sharing what they know.
Yeah, building on those funds of knowledge that students bring to the classroom. What are respectful and appropriate ways to engage community in teaching and learning?
I think one of the things that we're lucky with in our district is there are programs called role model programs, so that it's already been set up ahead of time that there are people within the community that have been approached and they have different knowledge and gifts that they bring to the classroom. So they're able to actually look at a role model program. If you don't have that, good people to look at and contact are the band offices and sometimes the education coordinators, and they usually know people in the community. They're from the community, so if you go to them, they're quite helpful in helping you to find people that you will need in the classroom or want in the classroom.
Are there protocols that educators should be mindful about when asking elders or knowledge keepers or others from the community to take part in our programming?
Well, normally if we're going to go to a chief, we know that we usually have a gift set aside. Even though they're coming and they'll donate their time, they're coming in as a volunteer, we usually have a gift in appreciation for that person when they're coming in for sharing their knowledge. The other thing is you have a conversation beforehand. you let them know, just, you let them know what is it that you're doing in the classroom, what is it that they're coming with and for, how long they're going to be, and what knowledge is it that they're going to be sharing with the students. And is it knowledge that is just for their house? Because if it's just for their house, they usually don't share that knowledge. But there are community stories that they can bring in as well.
So for educators to be aware that certain stories maybe aren't shared, given that they have ownership or belonging um, to a family or a house. Okay, thank you. I'd like to say Chimigwach, a big thank you to Virginia for taking part in our educator conversations and sharing with us her experiences and her expertise as a First Nations educator, and speaking to the ways in which we can think about how to be inclusive of Indigenous perspectives, Indigenous knowledges, Indigenous content, and certainly pedagogies in our teaching and learning, and the valuable contributions that this learning provides to young Aboriginal children and the opportunities for all learners.